Welcome to Mind Love Premium, episode 92. Today's episode is all about grief rituals for hope and healing.
That's the thing about a funeral. Like, our one remaining grief ritual is like an event. You know what I mean? Like, which requires event planning and a program and in some ways a performance. It lacks an intimacy that I think rituals from the past and rituals in other countries have. But a ritual to me is most powerful when it's something you do with someone else, with a group of people, and it has this agreed upon kind of meaning and purpose, and it speaks to a communal emotion or a communal need. And most grief rituals throughout history have involved like the neighbors and extended family. It kind of acknowledged our wider net of communal support. Whereas now we tend to grieve either alone or just in our small nuclear families.
It's a new day, a new episode, and a new opportunity to subscribe to the podcast. If you're listening for the first time, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you always know about new episodes. Plus, it makes you one of my favorite people, because the more subscribers I have, the more I attract amazing guests to help better serve you. So don't forget to subscribe. Grief is arguably one of the hardest things we humans have to deal with. And this might sound weird, but overall, life is neutral. Our emotional suffering doesn't just come from life events. Our suffering comes from our response to those events, the way we perceive them, and most of all, the meaning that we give them. Grief is such a prime example of that because it's our response to loss. We might think that it's the loss that hurts, but it's actually the grief that hurts. The loss just is. It's a byproduct of life. It happens to every single sentient being on Earth. But for some reason, when it happens to me, I can't help but think, there's no way other people hurt this badly. There's no way that this can be common because it's unbearable. There's something about grief that makes me feel like my suffering must be unique. Like, yeah, those people might have come close, but they don't really understand how I feel right now. And I think that part of the reason for that is to give myself an excuse to fall apart, because it's going to happen anyways. But if I know that almost everyone has experienced some kind of deep loss, then I start to wonder why I haven't seen other people breaking down like I am right now. And the truth is, a lot of people do. A lot of people break down, but they just do it privately. Some people cry for days at a time. Some never cry at all. Some self-sabotage, some hibernate, some just continue on with life. And some do have large public displays of breakdowns. There's a huge spectrum for how people deal with grief. But it's one of those things that I feel like we need a handbook for, and we just don't have one. So we're all just flying blind, feeling the weight of a huge loss, ruminating about how life will be without this, mentally jumping to future milestones and feeling the absence. And an example of this is sometimes I get really upset that my dad's not here, that he's not experiencing certain things with me and my son. But if he was still here, and in this moment that he wasn't in my house, wasn't playing with my child, would I feel the same sorrow as I do when I ruminate about all the things he's going to miss, rather than just focusing on that individual moment? So I don't think that there's a wrong way to deal with grief, but I do think that we make it harder on ourselves. We deepen our pain by focusing on what we don't have, which is something that creates suffering, regardless of if the focus is something we lost or just something that we've never had. And we also do things that keep our emotions stuck. And collectively, we keep this whole process a secret. We find it weird if someone is to break down at a grocery store or sob uncontrollably at work. Like, geez, Susan, can't you get your shit together? So not profesh. I saw a Facebook comment the other day where someone said that she has had 5 miscarriages and she deals with them alone because she hates the feeling of people pitying her. And I wondered, why does pity have such a negative connotation? It literally means the feeling of sorrow and compassion caused by the suffering and misfortunes of others. But the connotation of pity is that someone is somehow looking down on us for our misfortunes. The actual meaning of the word versus the meaning that we give it are different. Why is it that we reject the compassion and connection that people extend when we're suffering? Why does it feel safer to do it alone? I think that we're evolving into separateness. Historically, we've always lived more communally, and other countries still do it. Actually, in my late 20s, I hooked up with this guy and found out he still lived with his mom. But it was in a cool way because his family was from Spain, so that's just kind of what they do. And thank God, because she made bomb peanut butter and jellies. And wow, this tangent really pulled me, didn't it? Find the track and get back on it. Anyways, we used to gather around to support one another for every major life event. Weddings could last for days. Women served other women who would hibernate during menstruation. The whole village would help care for a newborn baby. And during grief, your friends, family, and even your neighbors gathered around to make sure that you had the space to grieve. It wasn't about entertaining them or about how they felt. It was about giving you the space to feel. We had collective rituals that helped us to feel connected, that gave space to the grieving, that kept life moving when the griever couldn't handle the little things. And we had rituals that told ourselves that it's okay to feel this way. Rituals that created a container for really big emotions so that we felt safe to express them. I wonder what it would look like if we still did that today. Maybe the way we each handled our grief would look a little more similar because we'd actually see other people doing it. Or maybe it would still be wildly different, but it would be more primal. There'd be less worry about how we look to others or others judging how we're handling it because there's this collective acceptance that this shit is hard. And because we show up for each other every time, we wouldn't be so shocked at displays of deep sorrow. But we're not given a framework for one of the hardest things that we deal with. We don't always openly share with each other about what we're experiencing, and so we judge ourselves or we judge each other. But just because we've lost the rituals that move us through it together doesn't mean that we can't get them back. Personally, when I'm in a deeply emotional state, it helps to have a framework. It's hard to think logically in the moment. So having a plan that moves me from one stage to the next, without that pressure being on me, is hugely helpful. So what would that look like today in the modern world? Well, today we're going to explore some of the most helpful grief rituals that are worth bringing back. And our guest is Amanda Held Opelt. She's an author, speaker, and songwriter, and she's spent the last 15 years as a social worker and humanitarian aid worker. She writes about grief and creativity and believes in the power of community, ritual, and shared stories to heal even our deepest wounds. So 3 key things we will learn are the power of Irish keening for releasing emotions, how to deal with fear around loss, and how to hold presence for grief, whether for yourself or a loved one. Before we go deep today, I want to give you a little gift, and I want to give it to you every single day. It's called the Morning Mind Love. I know how life can be. You're all fired up after an inspiring episode, and then a new day or a new challenge comes at you, and it's just hard to keep up that energy. Well, the Morning Mind Love is kind of like an oracle from your higher self to help you start each day with a positive focus. Plus, when you sign up, you get 2 free gifts, a 30-minute binaural meditation and 30 days of journaling prompts to help you remember who you truly are. And it's all completely free. So join over 9,000 people and go to mindlove.com to sign up or text the word morning to 33777. And now let's welcome Amanda Held Opelt to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Melissa.
So what is your story? What inspired you to focus on rituals for grief?
Yeah, well, I think like a lot of people kind of in our privileged society that we live in, I'd had a pretty easy childhood. My parents were just emotionally mature, well-adjusted. It was a trauma-free growing up experience. And honestly, I I can't remember going to a funeral until I was in maybe my teens. I think, I'd had grandparents that passed away, but they passed away when they were much older. And it was kind of that point in life where you say they had lived a full life, and we did a celebration of life at their funeral service. And so it felt like death in the right order, if that makes sense. I really hadn't experienced kind of a sudden, really catastrophic death until I got to my mid 30s. And during this season, during about a 4-year period, I lost my grandmother that I was really close to. She lived near me. She was really, really healthy. And then she became suddenly quite ill. And I was away on a work trip in Congo in East Africa when she died. And so I wasn't able to make it home for her funeral. And then shortly after that, I experienced the first of what would be 3 miscarriages over the course of 2 to 3 years. And that was really rattling because my husband and I had wanted a baby for quite a while and was struggling with infertility. And so when I got pregnant, it was just, we rejoiced. We were so excited. And then to lose the baby at 10 weeks was just really devastating. And then shortly after that, my only sister, Rachel, passed away very suddenly. She was perfectly healthy. She had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and she got the flu and struggled to recover, and then began experiencing brain seizures and suddenly died. And there wasn't really an explanation for exactly what had happened to her. And so here I am in a 3 to 4 year period experiencing these massive catastrophic losses in my life. And I felt like I was completely new to grief, because up until that point, I really had not experienced loss. And I don't know why we think we are going to be immune to death and suffering. When we've had an easy life, it's easy to think that that's how things are going to continue for you for the rest of your life. And I just was very surprised by grief and really felt like I had very few tools or coping mechanisms by which I could process what had happened to me and all the feelings and all the emotions I was experiencing. I think kind of, how your phone listens to you. I think my algorithm in my phone knew that I was grieving because it popped up an article about strange grief rituals from the past and strange grief rituals from around the world. And I started reading that article, and it was kind of this aha moment of, man, people throughout the ages, our ancestors knew how to dive deep into the experience of grief in a way that we don't in our modern culture. And so I just began to read everything I could get my hands on how people have processed death and dying and grief throughout the centuries to see if I could learn more about what was going on inside of me emotionally.
That makes so much sense. It's like we're not given a handbook for really anything in life except for all the things that we'll never use again.
Exactly.
It's like, thank you for all those books that you drilled into my head. Like I can make salt explode from chemistry, but why would I ever need to do that? But I don't know how to process my emotions.
Right.
Or budget a checkbook.
Exactly. It's kind of like wildly infuriating that I spent years in Algebra 1 and Algebra 2, and now I just do all my math on my phone. Like I wish
they're like, you're not going to carry around a calculator. Oh, really, Miss Dawson?
Right. Exactly. Joke's on you. And so it feels like, man, I wish we could have dedicated more of our education growing up on just some of these real life struggles that we're all going to face. And guess what? That's what people used to do. Like children used to be exposed to death. They would go to the viewing because viewings were often held in homes. And many of these grief rituals were practiced in the home with children around looking on. And some people might say, well, that's not appropriate or that's not age appropriate. But children became accustomed to the idea and comfortable with the idea that life doesn't last forever, that all people die, that grief is part of life, that pain is part of life. Death and grief was normalized for them. And so I wish that we had some mechanism for that in our world today.
I do too. And I remember reading about, I wish I could remember the specifics, but different cultures and the way that they handle their grief and things like knowing there's going to be like 3 days of solitude or like 6 weeks where people are bringing you food. And it's like now it's just like, oh, I hope Amanda's okay. Like maybe she'll get a text message or I'll just like her Facebook post about grief. And we don't see, first of all, the same amount of support that we used to have. I mean, they even used to have like the red tent for when women menstruated, like people would like tend to you back then. And now it's just like, don't bleed on me.
Right.
Just kidding.
Right.
I don't think those conversations are happening, but yeah. And so not only do we not have the same level of support, I think it's more than that. It's that the reasons that we don't have the level of support is that people aren't giving it the time or the space that they need, whether it's happening to somebody else or happening to them. Like, we're not viewing it the same somehow, if that makes sense. Why aren't we all crowding around those that are mourning and serving them for a couple of weeks? Because it's hard to get out of bed when you're grieving. It's like, I wonder what's really changed in that period of time that we've lost that. It's like, I wonder what's really changed in that period of time that we've lost that.
Yeah, Melissa, man, you made such a good point. We are a culture that associates happiness with success and happiness with normalcy. The wellness culture that we've seen emerge, kind of these life hacks that we try to implement in our lives to try to kind of reach this optimal way of living. We don't like the idea that life might be painful. We don't like the idea. We don't like kind of sitting with our discomfort or sitting with our sorrow. We try to circumvent it. We numb it. We can medicate any ailment that we experience in life. We just don't have that capacity for sadness that I think generations past did. And part of that is because, life expectancy has increased so much. And that's a good thing. I was reading somewhere that childhood mortality used to sit right at about 50%, which means that 50% of children didn't make it to their 5th birthday. I mean, can you imagine? And so I think that, people in generations past, they had to live kind of face to face with their own mortality. Whereas now, I think we can kind of convince ourselves that we can live forever. And we're a very affluent society. Most of us, and I don't want to speak for everyone, but most of us, have roofs over our heads and have air that is conditioned to the temperature that we like. We have access to food when we want it. And so that kind of the gnawing pain of hunger or the discomfort that so many people have experienced in generations past is foreign to so many of us. And so I think when things do fly off the rails, we kind of lose that sense that things are within our control. And we really do believe that life is in our control, that we can control our outcomes somehow, but we can't, not with everything. We're all mortal. And so I think kind of that American optimism, that always kind of searching on the new horizon for a better future, this pursuit of happiness that's so ingrained in our culture, part of that is the reason why we don't like to submit ourselves to the reality of grief and pain. I think another reason that we don't have these rituals in place like we used to is that we've kind of outsourced death and dying to the hospital and to funeral directors, if that makes sense. Like, people used to die at home. Back in the 1870s, there were less than 200 hospitals in this country. Well, in the 1920s, there were more than 6,000. And so people started, instead of dying at home, they started to go die at the hospital, which is a good thing, because sometimes when you go to the hospital to die, you don't actually die. They're able to save you. But people used to care for the dying in their home. People used to prepare the bodies of their dead loved ones at home. And that required ritual to kind of help name the holiness and the intensity of that experience. But now we've just kind of outsourced that to the hospital setting. We've outsourced it to funeral directors, which in many ways shields us from the reality of death. It shields us from grief. But you cannot outsource your grief. You can outsource death and dying, but you cannot outsource your grief.
That makes a lot of sense. We've outsourced way too many things, but even the rituals, if you really consider it, hospitals have their own rituals, and they're more like a system for like, okay, do this with the machine. Here's how we get the sign off for this, deciding when to unplug, naming the time of death. Like that in itself is a ritual. And so since it's happening, we do kind of give that over. But that's for them to feel closure as though they did everything they could. And then where does that really leave us? Mm-hmm. And I know that so often humans want a handbook for things. They want to know the next step. They want to be told what to do. Unless you're me, I do not like being told what to do. but I still like my system in place. I have a ritual for every morning, like of the day. And so, and so to have a ritual in place that your culture feels comfortable with, or even that you put in place for yourself, just so that you have that next step. It reminds me of when I was teaching about goal setting a couple years ago. I remember one of the big breakthroughs for me in setting my own goals was realizing that if I set my to-do list the night before, then I was way more likely to get things done than if I tried to do it in the morning, because in the morning, emotions came into play. Like, well, I don't know about this. You start to second guess yourself. But if I did it the night before, I'm like, okay, no question. I'm just doing this. Unless something big happened, of course, I could adjust. But for the most part, I just got to kind of leave emotion at the door and go step by step. And in a way, with mourning rituals, as in grieving rituals, it allows you the same thing, but not necessarily leaving the emotions at the door, but creating space for your emotions, because you're either in your head or in your heart. And if you're in your head trying to figure out that next step, what to do next, how to do this, then you're not giving a lot of space for that feeling. And I think it's that space and that willingness to actually feel the grief rather than escape it is what creates the healing and the transformation.
Oh man, you named it. That's exactly it. And I know for me, anyone that's experienced a really just life-altering, shattering grief knows that in the immediate aftermath of that, you don't know what to say, you don't know what to do, you can't eat, you can't sleep, you're in this complete fog. You feel like you're on another planet. The world without the person you love in it is another planet, and you are completely reorienting yourself to a new reality. And so there's something about rituals that really help set the body in motion, that give you a script of things to do when you don't know what to do, a script of things to say when you don't know what to say. And more than that, it also gives the community of condolers or people offering condolence, it gives them a list of things to do and say. Because how many people just sit at home wondering what it is, like you said, that they should do for the person who's grieving? Rituals gave the community something to do so that they didn't end up just liking someone's Facebook post, although I guess they didn't have Facebook back then.
I actually came across an article. It was in PubMed. It was called like From Ritual Mourning to Solitary Grief, and it was all about Hindu death rituals in India in light of COVID. And so one of the lines, I actually wrote it down, but it was talking about how, there's all these specific things that the Hindu people do together in order to mourn and grieve together. Yeah. And then those were taken away, and the words that this article used said something like, it results from the substitution of sacred ritual guidelines with the new profane ones for the disposal of deceased COVID-19 patients. And it was mostly just about how it stripped their ability to grieve in unison and how hard that was for them. And while I was reading it, I was thinking, so if taking away this unison of grief and of emotional expression is so damaging to them, why haven't we looked at the fact that we did that so long ago? Like, what damage is being done over and over again because we don't have a real way to come together and mourn life? And I just went to a memorial service actually a couple days ago, 2 days ago. And it was interesting because it was so great to see people you hadn't seen, but it also felt like a number of people had different expectations about what they were supposed to see or what was supposed to happen and feeling disappointed or whatever. And I'm like, see, we can't even get together our one ritual correctly. You know, what are all these failed expectations?
I know. Oh, I know. And there's so much, that's the thing about a funeral. Like our one remaining grief ritual is like an event, you know what I mean? Like which requires event planning and a program and in some ways a performance, you know, and I think funerals have their place and my goodness, let's please hold on to that one because it's kind of the last one we have. But again, it lacks an intimacy that I think rituals from the past and rituals in other countries have. I always get a little bit nervous when people ask me like, what is a ritual to you? Because I'm not a cultural anthropologist. Like I know that there's a lot of kind of academic language that, you know, helps explain what truly makes something a ritualistic practice. But for me, the most important element of a ritual is that it's done communally. And I'm like you, I have my morning rituals. You know, I get up, I read, I have my coffee, I have my habits and things like that. But a ritual to me is most powerful when it's something you do with someone else, with a group of people, and it has this agreed upon kind of meaning and purpose. And it speaks to a communal emotion or a communal need. And we tend to do so many things in life now individually and without our neighbors, without our extended family. I mean, and certainly the nuclear family has become the cornerstone of society. Most grief rituals throughout history have involved like the neighbors and extended family and gosh, even the farm animals would sometimes be involved in some of these rituals. It kind of acknowledged our larger wider net of communal support. Whereas now we tend to grieve either alone or just in our small nuclear families.
I know. I lost my dad when I was younger and I had no idea how to handle this. And so my method of dealing was really just to distract myself and to numb it. And I was just in college. And so there was plenty of access to numbing agents. But then I found myself really deeply grieving about 10 years later when I was finally allowing myself to feel. And then now just recently, I'm sure my listeners are like, okay, it's been a while now, but I lost my dog last month and it was really, really hard for me. My dog was the closest, I called him my person. He was my person in my life for so many years. I was with him for 15 years. He was with me through the tumultuous 20s where he just like saved my life. And so losing him was the first time I was really present for loss. And I'm sure some people out there are like, yeah, you can't compare a dog to your dad. But the other people, if they've had a bond with an animal, know that it's just as deep. I don't think it was any easier for me than losing a human. And so I wanted to be present with it this time. I'm not drinking at this stage in my life. I'm not going out and partying and whatever. And so I really just allowed myself to like sit in it and ask what's in this for me. And I do think it's moving through me faster. I still have my moments, but I had to find my rituals and I find that very diligently. Like I read books on like a book called How to Be Sad and like how to handle grief. And I'm like, okay, I will follow your guidelines because I'm seeking guidelines. Like I want somebody to tell me what to do in a way that will help me open up, even if I do it in my own way or from my own perspective. So I'm curious, when you were going through this grief, how did you find ritual and which ones did you feel like you were able to actually like sink into and felt like it maybe moved that emotion along?
Yeah.
How did you find ritual and which ones did you feel like you were able to actually like sink into and felt like it maybe moved that emotion along?
Yeah. You know, what I loved about my study of rituals is that each ritual I learned about told me something about the emotion that comes with grief or a need that is experienced in grief. And so like a lot of the rituals I studied were actually kind of based in superstition and the superstitions of fear. Two of the rituals that I learned about, one is covering the mirrors. It's this idea that if someone in the household dies, you need to cover the mirrors because whoever sees their reflection next will be the next person to die. Or there's a very strange ritual of telling the bees, which I was really interested in because my husband is a beekeeper. But it was this idea that you have to go, when someone in the household dies, you must go out to the beehives and tell the bees that that person had died. And you have to, quote unquote, put the bees in mourning, which means draping the beehives with black cloth. And if you don't do this, the bees are going to fly away and die or die. And to me, that was very, very strange. But what I realized in studying those two rituals is that, yes, fear is a natural part of grief. Because all of a sudden you realize how precarious your life is, that you're not in control. And so maybe rather than going out and telling my bees what had happened, although I guess I really could have done that because our beehives are just up the hill. Instead of that, what I did was I learned to listen to my fear and to caretake my fear and pay attention to it and speak truth to it. It really, learning about those rituals helped me understand that this tension I was feeling in my body was actually fear, and that fear is normal and fear is okay. But you need to speak to it and you need to tell the truth to yourself about what is stable in your life and what is trustworthy and true in your life. Another ritual that I studied, well, just kind of the vast array of food traditions surrounding death and grief. And for those of us in the South, I'm from the South. And so when someone dies, it's like you show up with baskets full of biscuits and fried chicken and pies and all this food. Well, other cultures have actually provided more nutritious food or symbolic food in the aftermath of death because they know that the body takes a beating when you're grieving. Physiologically, the reaction that you have is intense, headaches, weight loss, stomach aches, tension, sleeplessness. And so you really need to take care of your body in the aftermath of grief. You need to eat food and breathe deeply and rest and move your body as much as you can. And so again, for me, one of my rituals became just the habit of eating. I know that sounds silly, but after you've lost someone and you're completely wrecked by grief, it's hard to remember to eat and you don't feel like eating. Well, I kind of forced myself to eat and to give my body nutritious food so that I could kind of bear up under what was happening to my body physiologically. And then, I'm a person of faith. And so for me, prayer and being with other people of faith and reading, my holy scriptures, like these were important habits that really kept me tethered to my hope, to my peace. And there's a lot of great rituals for that kind of built into my faith tradition, I think, which really mattered and helped. But, it's also some of these rituals I would love for community to embrace at large, the tradition of wearing black after you've lost someone you died, so that kind of the world around you knows that you're having a hard time. Like I remember going to the grocery store like a week after my sister died and just being like, can you just let me go to the front of the line? Or can you just give me your parking space? And, I think I left my wallet in my car. It was like a mess at the register. And I think if I'd been wearing black, they would have been like, you know what? Let's just give her all the grace she needs. She's grieving. But there was nothing on my outer body to mark what was going on inside of me. But until we all kind of decide together that we're going to wear black when we're grieving, it doesn't necessarily mean much,
I know, and you need like the veil in front of your face, so you just, they're not just automatically from New York or something.
Right, exactly, I know.
I know what you mean, though. I specifically remember this time it was in college, and I was flying back home because my dad had just died. And I wasn't crying at this moment, but I was very depressed. And, the guy who checks your ID, he did one of those things that I feel like people finally wisened up and don't do as often anymore. But he was like, said something like, "You're such a pretty girl if you smile."
Oh, gosh.
And I just lost it. Immediately, I just started bawling my eyes out. And like, I wanted to shame him for not knowing that was the wrong thing to say. Like, don't you judge my appearance when I'm grieving right now? Like, I need to put on a smile to make you comfortable. Like, just it can infuriate me just thinking about it. But I'm one of those people who does sort of reach out to people, and I'm like, I like support from people, and so to have that kind of visual marker would be very helpful.
You know, you just summarized our society's problem with grief so well. Like, you'd be such a pretty girl if you smiled, right? Like, people want to be around us when we're happy. They want to be around us when we're hopeful. It's hard and uncomfortable to be around people that are sad, that are grieving, that are angry, that are scared. And so I think that's another reason why we numb our pain, is because we don't want to lose those connections with people. We don't want to make other people uncomfortable. We don't want to be the elephant in the room. Society is so affirming of positivity, and it is not affirming of, like, kind of the harsh truth of the sadness of existence. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, life is sad sometimes. Loss happens. Grief is normal. We're all mortal, so we're all going to die. Everyone you've ever loved is going to die. But we don't like to acknowledge that as a society. And we're not affirmed at all for our grief. We're affirmed for our positivity and happiness.
Yeah. And so not only do we feel like we're doing it wrong when we're actually doing it right, when we're sitting there and feeling and asking what's in this grief for us, being open to the change and the transformation that's on the other end, because that's what happened. That's what happened to me in my early 20s when I stuffed it all away. I didn't get that transformation until I decided to give it that space and that feeling. And so by expecting other people to, like, handle grief beautifully or however we want it to look, then we're also telling them that is not important, or that their feelings aren't valid, and ultimately what we're causing is generations of people who are still holding those unexpressed emotions in their body. And those are the things that build up and can turn into anything from just stress to a permanent disposition change to, like, actual disease. And it reminds me of one of the rituals that you talked about that I just feel like is so healthy. Tell us about keening.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because I was like, oh, we got to talk about keening. It's probably the first ritual that I really did a deep dive into. It was practiced in Ireland up until about the 1950s. And what would happen would be is that everyone would gather in the home of the deceased for the wake. Now, the Irish are well known for their rowdy, raucous wakes, which is a whole other conversation. But kind of the climax of the wake was this time of keening. Keening means crying in the Irish language. And there would be women in every community known in Ireland as the Ban Quinta. Quinta means the crier, so the lead crier. And these women would often serve as midwives in the community as well. So they knew that liminal space between life and death, between existence and non-existence. They would usher people into the world and usher them out. And so the Ban Quinta, the lead keeners, would come to the wake, and the whole community, the neighbors, the family, they'd all be there. They would gather in the main room, and the keener would begin to just softly moan. And then she would begin to cry. And then she would begin to say words in tribute, and they would kind of form into a melodic, a melody, a song, words paying tribute to the person that died, words talking about the pain of their loss. And then the song would kind of erupt into loud cries and screams, and the whole room would just begin wailing and screaming and singing their own songs in tribute to the deceased. And none of these there's only one recorded keen, because these songs were not written down and passed on from generation to generation, because they were improvised in the moment. And not only would people in the room grieve the person who had just died, they would also be grieving maybe a spouse that had died a year ago, or a daughter that had died 10 years ago. people would just be collectively moaning and screaming in that moment about all of the grief they experienced in life. And I just love this practice because I think, as we were saying, in today's society, we are most affirmed in our grief for being strong, for showing fortitude, for making it through the eulogies without blubbering, for being the strong one in the family that is kind of leading the family through this time of grief. When we do that, we are told that we're doing well. But what the Irish would say would be, if you aren't wailing, if you aren't completely losing it, then that's not okay. That's not normal. That's not healthy. I mean, I think about like, how would people respond today if someone was just to completely lose it in a funeral service? Like, you're kind of allowed to weep gently in a funeral, but you're not allowed to scream and moan and cry. Like, people would say, there's something wrong with you. But the Irish would say, there's something wrong with you if you're not doing that. You're not telling yourself the truth about how awful this is. And so I just think I think physiologically that was a healing experience. I think it provided a space for permission to fall apart in front of your neighbors, and to see them falling apart. I just think about how intimate and beautiful that experience must have been. And it's not only the Irish who wail. I mean, there are countries in West Africa that still wail aloud at funerals to this day and all over the world. It's just not done in our culture.
I do it. You will hear me wail if I am grieving in general. Even last time I was pregnant, I had a few moments. I just dealt with pregnancy depression for a while, and I had these moments, and it was one of those things where I knew that earlier in my life, I didn't know how to handle grief. I knew the tools that I have acquired over the years. And so I'm like, if I feel this, I need to release it. And so sometimes you'd hear me crying like a toddler. And I did the same thing when my dog died. And I am so grateful that I had shared my previous experience with my husband, because it is uncomfortable because we haven't normalized that. It's uncomfortable for most people to sit with somebody in that way, but it's all that I needed. And I had shared so many stories of him with him, like back when my dad died. It was mostly the age, like I was back at college, like about to go out, and my roommates were trying to make me feel better. So they'd be like, let's take a shot, like anything to divert my attention onto anything else. And so there were times where even then, even without the tools or the knowledge of why, I could feel myself wanting to talk about him. And so I'd bring him up, and people would think they were doing right by me by diverting the conversation. But all I really needed in that moment was for somebody to be willing to carry on the conversation with me. It's like I wanted to carry on his memory, or I wanted to express this, whatever the motive was. I needed to release it, and I wanted someone else to be there to receive it, rather than clearly showing their discomfort that like this was unmanageable for them. And so if it's unmanageable for them, how am I supposed to perceive that? How manageable are the real emotions that I'm feeling and I don't know what to do with, and I don't know how to express them? And now I'm not only feeling badly because of this situation and the loss, but now I'm feeling badly because I'm putting other people into a position of that they don't want to be in. And I think that was one of my favorite things about living in Los Angeles was there's a whole lot of people who work on emotions in like Santa Monica. I was a part of women's groups and things like that. And so it was the first time in my life really where I dealt with something where when I was dealing with something, I felt like I had a soft cushion to land in. Like there were a number of people that I knew with open arms that they're like, let me just hold space for you. Do what you need to do.
That's right. Yeah. And that's all I think a griever wants is for someone to, I don't know, I'm getting emotional. I do know I'm getting emotional. This is emotional. I just want someone to go to that deep, dark space of grief with me and to not be afraid of that. I think that's all we want when we're grieving. But again, we live in a culture that has normalized happiness and marginalized pain. happiness is the normalcy that we're all comfortable with, and pain is something we're just not comfortable with. It's not normal for us.
What are any rituals that you found that helped you to kind of find that community with people of feeling supported in ways that we don't really have today?
Well, I looked at a lot of Jewish grieving practices, and I was really fortunate. I have a friend named Shelley who grew up in Israel. She's Jewish. She lost her mother and her sister in a car accident when she was only 20 years old. Her sister was 9 months pregnant at the time. And then her grandmother died a week later, just from the shock of it all. And so obviously Shelley has experienced profound loss. And so she knows, all of these different Jewish grieving rituals that were so healing for her. And one in particular that spoke to me was sitting Shiva. It's somewhat familiar to people, but Shiva is a 7-day period after the burial where visitors just come to the home of the grievers and just sit and be with them and be present with them. And you basically have visitors for 7 days from morning until night. And I remember when Shelley was telling me about it, thinking like, that sounds awful. I mean, I'm an introvert, so I was like, that sounds kind of terrible. But what I realized is that in Shiva, you kind of have to submit yourself to a set of kind of understanding and acceptance of your own weakness in the midst of your grief. And so when people are coming to visit, you are not playing the host, which is what I would be inclined to do. You are not trying to impress people with your strength, which is what I would be trying to do, which is why it would be exhausting for me. No, what Shelley told me is that you don't wear makeup. You don't wash your hair. You just allow yourself to just be sad and grieving. And it's called sitting Shiva. You sit in low chairs, like chairs that are sitting low to the floor to kind of symbolize that we are laid low in grief. And people just come and they clean your house for you, and they bring you food, and they sit with you. And, she told me that really the condolers take their cues on how to behave from the person who's grieving. And so if the griever is crying, then the visitors will cry with you. If the griever is sitting silently, they will sit silently with you. And if the griever's laughing and sharing stories, then the condolers will laugh and share stories. And I think I realized that in order for rituals to work, in order for me to really be with people in an intimate way in my grief, I have to kind of give up this performance of strength. I have to give up my desire to impress people and show people how strong I am. And when you do that, then there's, the presence of other people really can be like a healing balm. And I was fortunate enough to have friends like that in my life when I went through this season. People who didn't just give me pithy responses, about like, oh, well, everything happens for a reason, or, well, the silver lining is this, or, oh, your sister wouldn't want you to be sad. It's like, oh, yes, she would. She would want me to be very sad. This is very sad. I didn't have people saying those kinds of things to me. I had people who were willing to come and just sit with me and be with me and cry with me. And I know not everybody has that. And it really is necessary, I think, for processing your grief, is to have those people around you doing that for you.
Right. I think I always find it so funny when people are like, your dad wouldn't want this for you. I'm like, I think my dad would want me to be processing this the way I can handle and the way that's healthiest for me, not in the way that makes you most comfortable. And,
right.
And I think that's part of the reason where so many people might be listening to these things and kind of like you said earlier, like, I don't know, this part of sitting Shiva sounds intimidating or even awful, but that comes from the way we think that would look. And the way we think that would look is the expectations of other people, or how people basically have expectations of what grief is supposed to look like, what their comfort levels are, versus having a cultural understanding or collective understanding of like, this is really hard. Like, we need to acknowledge that this is really what grief looks like. And the way to actually show up for someone is to go and just wrap them in your arms, even if they haven't showered in 7 days, because they just can't handle it. Like, maybe it's even lowering them into the bathtub and washing their hair for them. Like, it might be different per person. It might be similar per person. It might be ugly and messy, but that is what real support looks like, not this like perceived thing of bringing flowers and hoping that their makeup looks as good as yours does.
Right. And isn't that, I mean, that's just kind of just one more insidious thing about grief, is that it's so humbling. It's just, it reminds you that you and the people you love are mortal and life is precarious and you're not okay. Like, don't we all just want to be okay? Well, sometimes we're not okay. And we don't have the strength that is required to even take care of ourselves. Right. And so grief, I don't know, to me, one of the most important things you can do as a first step on your healing journey is to say, I'm not okay and I need help. I need help getting through this. I need presence. I need someone to remind me to eat. I need someone to clean my house. And then slowly, little by little, we're able to pick those things up on our own. But it's just, I've said it before, grief is humiliating. But there's a sense in which it's a holy humiliation, because I think to be reminded of our own finiteness, to be reminded that we don't have to be perfect all the time, that we don't always have to be the strong one, that's actually a good thing. That's a good thing to be reminded of that. It's good to be reminded that we can rely on other people and that we can ask for help.
Yeah, and the word humiliating is interesting because it rings so true. And also, it has such a connotation of like, the only way to really feel humiliated is in the presence of other people. And again, it kind of goes back to their expectations. And so it's whether or not those expectations that we perceive are real or that we're just perceiving them because that's the standard that we set. And I like the way you said, like, we need to be able to speak that. Like, that's one of the ways that we can invoke change is by being that change and saying what we need. And on the other hand, that's so difficult when you're in a state of grief. Yeah. And so I told you I went to a memorial the other day, and one of the things that happened is the wife of the person who died, my aunt, she showed up like an hour and a half late. And her daughter was putting it on and she was kind of stressed because she's like, she's not even here. Like Gary's here and wants to say hi to her and like, she's going to miss him. And I'm like, I don't know if that's the focus right now. You know, like, I don't think we're all here because we need to make sure that this guy she knew in high school can see her right now. Like, it's not about him. Yeah. If anything, the person that it's most about is the wife of the person who just died, the one that they were best friends and that they don't really have a lot of outside friends. They had each other and now she lost him and she's going through that. And like, if she shows up here in footy pajamas and like drenched in sweat, then that's how she can make it. And if she doesn't show up at all, then that's fine too, because this is her process, and nothing about us coming together for support should be putting pressure or creating those expectations or like, you know, like kind of forcing this process. Like, it's not about us, it's about her. And so I think that's one of the ways too, is that we can help bring forth this change is to speak up when we're seeing other people grieve or when we're trying to show people a way to really be that support system for one another. Yeah. I'll never forget that Shelley said to me, you know, that the funeral for her mother and her sister was in Israel. And she said, all my Israeli friends came dressed in sneakers and comfortable clothes to the funeral. And she said, all my American friends came dressed like they were going to a job interview. She's like, they were in their pearls and their suits. And she was like, what are you trying to prove here? Like, we're just all trying to be comfortable because we're trying to survive this grief and it's not about the performance. And I just remember being that having such an impression on me, because I know I spent like hours and hours trying to pick out an outfit for my sister's funeral. I don't know, you find the one thing you can control, I guess, and you fixate on it. But I think that just that is one of the key elements of moving forward on your journey of grief, is of letting go of the performance and letting go of trying to impress not only others, but impressing yourself. You know, this is not about proving to yourself or proving to God or proving to your family or friends that you're okay and that you're strong. It's about naming and being honest with yourself about how devastated you are. You have to
tell yourself the truth before you can proceed into this new reality.
I agree with all of that. And thank you for bringing this to us because, like we said earlier, we don't really have a framework, especially culturally. I feel like there's not a whole lot like that's cultural in America anymore. And so we're just like grasping at straws, creating our own rituals and routines. And it is helpful for a lot of people to have some sort of framework, some sort of guidance. And we have so many good ideas of specifics from this episode, but also just general ideas about like confronting your fear and holding presence and holding space for that morning and the way that we support one another and the expectations that we shouldn't have. And so thank you for your research here. And for listeners that are interested in learning more and about you, where's the best place that they can connect with you and also find your book?
Yeah, so you can order my book, anywhere that books are sold. It's called A Hole in the World, Finding Hope in Rituals of Grief and Healing. You can also find me at my website, amandaheldopelt.com. And I'm often on Instagram, sometimes on Twitter, but mostly on Instagram at amandaheldopelt. And I like to share a lot about grief rituals there, grief rituals I didn't even write about in the book. I try to share about on Instagram and also share some of the great resources that are out there on grief and grieving. Those are the kind of conversations I like to have on Instagram. So yeah, come join me there.
All the links for this episode are at mindlove.com/X92. I'm going to give you a challenge that's going to be helpful to anyone, whether you're grieving or not. And the challenge is to find acceptance for emotions, whether they're yourself or other people. Notice if you have a feeling of judgment or a thought when you see somebody's public display of emotion, or when you feel like you're being too big or too small in an emotional way. And just notice it and see if you can redirect that thought or that feeling. And this is where that Rolodex of mindsets that I talk about comes in handy. Because sometimes I'll just flip through different ways to think about a situation until one of them really lands and feels right. One good example is when I feel that minor twinge of road rage, and I'm like, this jerk over here, like, what the hell? And instead I change the story to one that his wife is in the back seat, almost delivering a baby, and he had to cut me off right there. And suddenly I'm like, you go, I'm on your team. It's highly unlikely that that's happening at all, but who cares? I can't change it. The only purpose is to find inner peace, and if that's what gives it to me, then why not land on that? And so the same can go for giving yourself or other people space for their emotions. Just allow. And if you do know someone else that's grieving, how can you create that safe container? Maybe you show up with a casserole and you just give that person verbal acknowledgement that their feelings are okay. Or maybe you give the same thing to yourself and you have a good cry. So notice how you feel, notice how you judge, how you think about your emotions and other people, and see what you can do to create that safe space container. And let me know how it goes. Reach out to me on Instagram at mindlovemelissa or leave a comment right here on the show notes page. If you'd love to support Mind Love, you can do that by joining Mind Love Premium at mindlove.com/premium. You get over 50 exclusive episodes that are only for premium members. And you also get bonuses like meditations, ad-free listening, and early release episodes. You can also support one of my amazing sponsors, and they're all listed at mindlove.com/sponsors. And finally, you can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And if you do, I'll probably read your review on the show. So thanks for giving your mind a little love today, and I'll see you next time.